Hello and welcome to Keith Anime and Politics channel. Today, I would like to talk about the results of the Hong Kong district election and its impact on the protests and Hong Kong in general. First of all, let's not kid ourselves. The protesters will be emboldened by the recent results. The pro-protesters parties won 17 out of 18 of the district contested. The one district they didn't win was because 8 of the 18 seats are actually appointed by the government, and the pro-protesters won 7 over 10 of the contested seats. Previously, all 18 districts were controlled by pro-government parties. Furthermore, there is a few special interest constituency which was also won by the pro-protester. One is a police residential area where most of the people are families of the police. Surprisingly, the pro-protesters won there. And a further 2 more constituency, which is mainly populated by China immigrants. Previously, these 2 were uncontested because everyone thinks that China immigrants surely pro-China lah. But surprisingly, 2 unknown candidates who were put under the pro-protesters banner won. These 3 constituency results really surprised election watchers. There's 2 things that I expect will happen. One, the protesters will continue even fiercer than ever before until the declaration of martial law, I guess. And the second, Carrie Lam will not be able to run for re-election or maybe even resign before her term ends. Let's examine a bit about the protesters' background. They are mostly youngsters and the bottom half of the population in terms of income. They are mainly categorized into 2 groups: the Wo Lei Fei, Wo for Wo Ping, Lei for Lei Ji, and Fei for Fei Po Lei. These are the peaceful protesters and make up the overwhelming majority of the protesters. They skew 20 to 40 years of age. I call them the peaceful group. The black-clad protesters and masked protesters are the second group, known as the Yong Mo, as in Yong for Yong Gam and Mo for Mo Sut, Wushu. I shall call them the mask group. These are the ones burning and destroying public property in protest. Their motto is Hing Tai Pa San Kok Ji Lo Lei, which means each one do their best in protesting their own way. This group is very young, mostly teens aged 13 to 18 and university students. The mask group usually acts without the approval of the peace group. However, the peace group have also refrained from condemning the violence of the mask group. So they kind of coexist to fulfill shared goals, even if their methods are vastly different. So now we know who. Let us now examine what the protesters are after. They have 5 demands. The first, the withdrawal of the extradition bill. This has been done. Case closed. Secondly, the withdrawal of the characterization of the protests as riots. This one is possible because it's just semantics, and only part of the protesters have used extreme violence. Next is a general amnesty for those arrested, and this would disappoint the police force who have been forced to work long hours against the Yong Mo. This is tough to be agreed on, but can be done. Fourth, we have the establishing of an independent commission to investigate instances of police brutality. This is possible too because it is neutral. The commission could report either way, favoring the protesters or the police. And Hong Kong has a long history of establishing independent commission. And finally, the protesters also demand full universal suffrage for the Legislative Council and the committee which elects the Hong Kong Chief Executive. China's response has been, this is a very tough pill for the Chinese government to swallow, because they fear, rightly so, if Hong Kong enjoy full universal suffrage, other provinces in China would ask for it by violent means. So this China won't allow it. This strengthening protest has only 3 conclusions in sight. First is a crackdown by the Chinese military. That is because the protesters will not waver in their revolution as they feel vindicated by the results of the district election. The protesters are willing to die together with China, as the Americans say, liberty or death. By enacting the anti-face mask law under the emergency ordinance, de jure, Carrie Lam has established a state of emergency which grants her wide-ranging powers. But the face mask law was struck down for unconstitutionality for being incompatible with the basic law by a Hong Kong court. China reacted furiously with a statement by the NPC spokesperson stating they were the only arbiter of the basic law. This is nonsense. Everywhere in the world, all lower courts have the power to rule on matters of constitutionality. China is the final arbiter of the basic law, not the only one. Furthermore, this statement came without a request from the Hong Kong side, which by the basic law is required. In other words, this is uncharted territory, a war of law, so to speak. All that is why I believe the scenario will develop into a Hong Kong government requesting Chinese assistance in quelling the protests, which will manifest itself into martial law. There will be a great clash between China and protesters. This would result in a repeat of Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. The name of Carrie Lam would go down in history as the one who requested China to step in. Qin Gu Zui Yan, the villain of 1,000 story. Doomsday, you say? Maybe. But the second scenario too is a doomsday scenario, but for the PRC side. What if Hong Kong persists in escalating the violence, the protests, without Carrie Lam requesting China to come in? In the medium term, the Chinese people who sympathize with the protests might just start expressing themselves and start demanding reforms of Chinese law itself. Even if just 1% of the population sympathizes with Hong Kong, that's 14 million patriots who would fight for freedom in China. Universities across China would be a hotbed of dissent, and the Chinese students would rise up too, in support and in imitation of the Hong Kong protests. Revolution would break out across China and the CCP would crumble. All this could happen the longer the Hong Kongers persist in their protests. Fairy tale? It's improbable, I'll admit, but hardly impossible. All revolutions started with a minor uprising that spread across geography exponentially. As long as Hong Kongers persist, the day shall come when Hong Kong and China are united by a liberal democracy ideology. Now, to avoid the bloodstained scenario or the highly improbable fairy tale I just mentioned, Carrie Lam must choose the third scenario, that is negotiations with the protesters and Beijing. She should accede to some of the demands of the protesters, even if it goes against Beijing's instincts. Beijing can be won over by some determined persuasions by Carrie Lam. This is not easy and would take some time and skill. I foresee a best case scenario of the first 4 of the 5 demands being met. The last demand, universal suffrage, is completely out of the question for now, because violence was used, so China will never agree. This is the preferable choice for Hong Kong and the Hong Kong government. Anyway, that's it for part 1 of the Hong Kong protests. My next video will cover the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and its practical impact on Hong Kong. Thank you for watching and please subscribe if you enjoyed the video.